Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to all the KTV viewers to this very special Sikh Network show, Declassified. Today's show will be talking about what is close to the hearts of many Sikhs around the world, and that is the 1984 genocide and assault on Sri Darbar Sahib Amritsar, codenamed Operation Blue Star. And in particular, the role of the UK government in assisting Indira Gandhi on planning the most deadliest attack on our Sikhs' most holiest shrine. Now, 1984 is enshrined in the psyche of every Sikh, in that the devastation that happened in the first week of June and the complete destruction of the Sri Akal Takht Sahib is something that no Sikh has forgotten. But for British Sikhs, in 2014, this whole episode took a whole new turn. In January 2014, it was uncovered that the British government was directly involved in Operation Blue Star, and it was complicit in the genocide of Sikhs in years to come. But it didn't stop there. The British government's involvement and support of Indira Gandhi's strategy to target Sikh males also crossed the continents and came into the UK. And British anti-Sikh measures were deployed for decades to suppress and curb Sikh activism and civil rights, all in the name of truth and justice and freedom for Sikhs of Punjab. In January 2014, independent researcher and investigative journalist Phil Miller shocked the world when he uncovered classified documents that were released under the 30-year rule, which brought to the light the level of involvement of the British government and Margaret Thatcher. Personal letters between Margaret Thatcher, the British government, and the Indian government, in which they requested the highest level of military support from the British government, that being the SAS, to come and help them plan the raid and assault on Sri Harmandir Sahib. That support was granted and given, and we now know today that an SAS officer spent 6 days with the Indian Army, took a helicopter to Amritsar, and spent 10 days undercover doing a recce of Sri Darbar Sahib and completed a report for the British government to share with the Indians. We also know that the British government continued their support in military arms, in training, equipment, and in many other counterinsurgency and many other ways. All something that was denied and attempted to cover up by the British government. The uproar that these papers caused in 2014 forced the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, to publicly launch a review. And that review had two sides to it. The first side, the Allen Review, was a very much internal review of how these papers even came to light. And the second, more public review was that conducted by the highest civil servant, the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Jeremy Haywood. Now, that review, many Sikhs called a whitewash, was done very quickly and pretty much, in short, limited the British government's assistance to that SAS officer and report and review, which they declared was not used. However, my special guest today, and someone who has spent many years looking at the British government's controversial involvements in conflicts around the world, but in particular his work in Sri Lanka and the genocide there, but also through his initial discovery of the Sikh genocide and the Amritsar papers, he's continued his research in this field. So I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Miller today, because he's been involved in another FOI case, Freedom of Information case, against the government, who have continued this program of censorship and cover-up. And this is now the second case that Phil has brought to the High Court, and he'll be sharing the details of that case and what it means, not only for the truth for 1984, but also for Sikhs wider. But before I let Phil give us an update, I just sincerely want to thank Phil on behalf of the global Sikh community for his dedication, for his perseverance, and his passion for helping us bring the truth out in the open of what really happened in those deadly months of June 1984. So thank you, Phil, on behalf of the whole Sikh community. I know something this is so close to the heart of Sikhs. What you've given us is something 35 years on, something to hold on to, that actually one day the truth will prevail, and it's through the efforts of people like yourself that give us that impetus to actually continue this journey. So Phil, share with us of where this story started and those original documents that you discovered, and then how they led on to where we are today.
Yeah, thanks, Jazz. I mean, I think you introduced it very well. I found these papers in 2014 while I was looking for information on the SAS in Sri Lanka. I looked at Britain's foreign policy towards neighbouring countries and found these papers about Amritsar. What happened next is it's been a cover-up, as you described it, by the British government, and a cover-up of the cover-up. So this Hayward Review, their internal inquiry into how this happened, it turns out that effectively they let British diplomats who were at the heart of the scandal in 1984 to mark their own homework in 2014 when the evidence came to light. So what I mean by that is British diplomats who were involved in UK-India relations in 1984, who were writing the files in 1984, when I revealed that the SAS had gone out to India, they were allowed, these same officials were then allowed to help select what files the inquiry saw. So they had some kind of influence over what material the inquiry team saw. And we know that the inquiry team didn't see a crucial file from the month after the massacre in Amritsar, where it looked like more SAS training was being discussed. Now, we don't know whether or not that went ahead, but the inquiry team didn't even see this file. And clearly that would have put a completely different angle on the Hayward Review, whose conclusion, remember, was that this was a one-off and it had limited impact. In fact, it may well have been part of the pattern.
Yeah, and the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, came to the floor of Parliament and said those exact words, even though he was challenged by politicians from all parties on wider support, both in the UK and years later in Black Thunder. And all of that was denied. And I remember at the time, the government, whilst under huge pressure, internationally and politically, to conduct a judge-led independent inquiry. I know the Sikh Federation led the campaigns and calls for an independent judge-led inquiry, something the Labour Party later inserted into its political manifesto. But they refused to do a review and kept their, if you like, limited it to the Hayward Review, which, despite them saying they looked at 200 files and nearly 20,000 letters, they still missed critical information leading up to the attack, because all of that information, as you uncovered months and years later, was all about the arms trade and the discussions of Western helicopters, other military equipment, and how the British High Commission in India was looking to secure military contracts for favours of supporting India's strategy and military policy against the Sikhs. But also, as you said, post-June 1984 and how the support continued. So I guess when there was, you mentioned the post-June 1984. We all know what happened in June and the devastation that was caused in Amritsar. And whilst the British government said that was it, but letters came out dated the 3rd of July. So less than a month after the attack, of senior civil servants, conversations between the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and Number 10 of additional support and training. And that was part of your request for information, which was denied, and you subsequently, we took that to the High Court. So what was in those papers, and what was the response from government to refuse those, and how did that play out?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, there was a previous information tribunal case that I was involved in and that the Sikh Federation supported. These cases go to the first tier tribunal, so it's slightly different from the High Court, but it's you go before a judge and two other tribunal members. So that case was looking at a couple of files that weren't being released to the National Archives. There was one particular file that had been drawn up by the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is a very senior Whitehall body which has the heads of the intelligence agencies, heads of the military, the Foreign Office, DFID, all sitting on this committee. It had a file about political developments in India from this period that we wanted access to. And what was very interesting about that case was that they put forward a civil servant called Philip Barton as the government's main witness to argue why this file couldn't be released to us. And his evidence was so secret that beyond his job title, he insisted everything else had to be heard in secret court. And it was only after the secret court hearings that our lawyers were able to get parts of what he said declassified to us. And some of the things he wanted secrecy for were ridiculous. There was a definition of the Joint Intelligence Committee that was also on Wikipedia, and he was trying to say that that definition could only be discussed in secret court. So what I'm trying to say here is there's a civil servant who's extremely secretive and seems extremely pro the central government in India. And what's important is that this civil servant, Philip Barton, went on to be Britain's High Commissioner to India and has now just been made the permanent secretary of the Foreign Office. So he's now Britain's top diplomat. Is this man who, in the last few years, has been determined to help cover up the extent of Britain's role in the Sikh genocide.
Yeah. And that name is very relevant today as well. So Philip Barton, as you mentioned, whilst he was the British High Commissioner in India, we also are well aware of the ongoing case of Jagtar Singh Johal, who is a British national who's been abducted for over 1,000 days in Indian jails without charge, subject to third-degree torture. And Philip Barton was scheduled to meet with Jagtar's brother, Gurpreet Singh Johal, this week, in fact, to discuss what was happening, because there's been very little activity from the British government, certainly in Delhi, to really lobby and push for not only an investigation into the claims of torture, but just to the due process. 1,000 days later, he still faces no charge. But it's now very telling that this individual now, not only is he connected to the past events of 1984, but also now has left that role, cancelled his meeting, and is now heading up, like you said, the senior most civil servant in the Foreign Office. That this is worrying sign for Sikhs with the ongoing human rights cases that Sikhs raise.
Yeah, and I think while Philip Barton was High Commissioner to India, there was a lot of British military training for the Indian security forces, despite what's been going on in Kashmir as well. So in addition to the abuse of political prisoners, there's also the whole scale crackdown in Kashmir. And the British military has been very happy to train Indian security forces in these last few years. And as the High Commissioner in Delhi, Philip Barton would have certainly had a hand in ensuring that training went ahead, and making the case for India to buy British weapons for those troops who'd received British training. So I think that seems to be where his mind's been at the last few years, and not about standing up for the human rights of political prisoners of British Sikhs detained in India.
And you mentioned the training, because that's what the later letters really detail, is that less than a month after the bloody attack where thousands of pilgrims lost their lives and a genocide was started across all of Punjab, codenamed Operation Woodrose, that knowing and having seen the devastation, and there is a letter dated the 14th of June, personal letter from Indira Gandhi to Margaret Thatcher, thanking her for the support. And it goes on to say that Sikhs in the religious garb, i.e. the turban, the beard, and the kirpan, are most dangerous, and that she should clamp down on Sikhs in the UK that are protesting. And this is the length of the the Indian government's influence on the British, in that they wanted presidents of the Gurdwaras arrested and interned, and even protesters shot. I mean, this was the level of civil liberties, clampdown and abuse of human rights that the British government was entertaining with Indira Gandhi. But a month later, letters to, and we'll mention Bruce Cleghorn, because he's also relevant even today in terms of reviewing these files, as you uncovered. But requests were made for further SAS assistance in the setup of the National Security Guard, the NSG, which was modeled on the SAS. And we also know, because these letters indicate, that support was requested and no doubt given, because it was considered very advantageous to trade with India. But also we know the NSG was set up and was involved in 2 further military assaults on Sri Darbar Sahib, codenamed Black Thunder 1 and Black Thunder 2 in 1986 and 88 respectively. So the British government again are complicit in further attacks on the Sikh community. And you took this to the High Court, and the government argued that this was it was the typical national security line, but also that it would damage the relations with India. And tell us how the judgment went in that case, because I believe it was a landmark judgment in this tribunal case.
Yeah, so that judgment was very helpful in some regards, because it said actually this disclosure would not damage international relations with India. You know, the events took place so long ago, things have moved on to some degree at least, and the government's argument that releasing these files from the 1980s would harm relations with India, that just didn't stand up. And also, because there's such a strong public interest in understanding Britain's role in the Sikh genocide, that would outweigh any risk of damage to international relations. So that was quite a strong and a helpful judgment to have from the court. The only barrier we were really facing was these blanket exemptions for information about the special forces and the intelligence agencies, which, unless the Freedom of Information Act is reformed and made more powerful, which I as a journalist think it should be, then we're left demanding an inquiry, because an inquiry would have the power to scrutinise all the paperwork, including material involving the special forces and the intelligence agencies. And certainly it was being discussed a month after the massacre that more SAS training should be given to help set up this new unit, the National Security Guard, which, as you say, went on to be involved in operations Black Thunder 1 and 2. We don't know for sure whether or not that went ahead, but it seems at the moment, short of a leak or the Freedom of Information Act being given new powers, the only way we'll find out would be through a proper independent inquiry. And by an independent inquiry, that would be one where former diplomats such as Bruce Cleghorn are not allowed to select which files are seen by the inquiry, but rather they are called as witnesses to have to give evidence in public and to be cross-examined by lawyers representing the Sikh community.
Because that's quite an interesting bit, that Bruce Cleghorn, who's mentioned in these letters, and was a senior diplomat at the time in 1984, was then also involved in reviewing. The government had appointed an individual who's named in these files to review the files and deem which ones were appropriate to share under the 30 rule. And that's like, you can only say you mark your own homework, right? It's like, these files we already know these files were highly in the public interest and of huge consequence and significance to the Sikh community, but also the wider global community, because Sri Amritsar, the Darbar Sahib, is a recognized shrine religious institute globally. Yet they still allowed, rather than having independent scrutiny, they appointed individuals who were involved in these discussions to review what should be declared and open and shared with the public. And that, I guess, leads up to the second FOI tribunal case, because, again, certain individuals have again been come under question, and their role come under question in terms of what are they doing to suppress and censor very relevant and necessary information?
Yeah, by 20, I found that Bruce Cleghorn, this who had been at the heart of UK-India relations in 1984, he'd even it would be hugely embarrassing for the British government if our role in anything to do with the Golden Temple came to light. So this chap, Bruce Cleghorn, I knew that he'd been working as a sensitivity reviewer for the Foreign Office, which meant that he'd been helping to censor the files that were being transferred to the National Archives, which is highly significant given how heavily redacted some of those files are, including the one about the National Security Guard. What I couldn't prove in 2017 was whether Cleghorn had been allowed to select files for the Hayward review. I knew that sensitivity, I didn't know necessarily whether he was one of them. So this is why I made this extra freedom of information request, which ended up going to court again. And it had two questions. The first one was specifically about Bruce Cleghorn, which the judge said, you know, that they're going to refuse to answer that one because of his data protection rights. But my second question was more general, and it just said, did any British diplomats who were involved in UK-India relations in 1984, were they allowed to select files for the Hayward Review, or help select files for the Hayward Review? And the judge said they had to answer that question. So this was March 2020. The judge ordered the Foreign Office to answer this question, and then it was in June, so many months later, the Foreign Office finally answered this simple question, and they said one or more officials who'd been involved in UK-India relations in 1984 was allowed to select files for the Hayward Review. So it looks, you know, very likely that one of those officials was Bruce Cleghorn, but we can't say 100% say whether or not it was him. But the fact the government is still trying to cover up that kind of detail, I think it just shows how shady they're being about this whole affair.
Yeah, and this is the thing that concerns Sikhs around the world, in that not only were the two letters you originally identified the smoking gun, but actually you spent months researching more files, even the ones that they withdrew. They released files, they withdrew them, and I know the Sikh Federation and yourself and lawyers, KRW Law, then wrote to the Foreign Office and started to make legal representations, and then the files quickly were returned, but the four files that were very pertinent to the NSG and other events related to the Amritsar incidents were withheld, and that's what then constituted the case. But throughout your research, and you published a report called Sacrificing Sikhs, which is available on the Sikh Federation website at sikhfeduk.com, a 60-page detailed report of wide range of government conversations, not only in the run-up to Operation Blue Star and the trade negotiations, the actual involvement and how the Home Secretary at the time and the Foreign Secretary both were aware that a military operation would happen and refused to share any advice to British nationals travelling abroad, despite there being 500,000 Sikhs living in England. But also then the subsequent support, continued military armaments and trade, and then the UK impact on civil liberties and anti-Sikh measures. All of that was well documented in the Sacrificing Sikhs report, and it was shocking to read. But what's been your take on what you've sort of uncovered, written, and that whole approach to Indo-Sikh relations with the British government?
Yeah, I think it really would take another court case probably to force this issue, not a freedom of information case, but some kind of judicial review at the High Court of the government's refusal to do an independent inquiry, and perhaps this latest revelation about the conflicts of interest in the Hayward Review might be enough grounds in terms of fresh evidence to do that. But I'm a journalist, not a lawyer, so whoever wanted to do that would need to seek legal advice. But I think if you looked at what Campaign Against the Arms Trade managed to achieve with getting a suspension on new arms sales to Saudi Arabia for nearly a year, and that was through taking the government to court. So I think with these kind of issues, it's only really when the government are put in the dock that these things will start to unravel. I think otherwise they will just try and focus on military training and arms sales to India, which is you know, their default gear really. That's what they know, and obviously it's highly lucrative for people connected to the government for this
And
to
share
be
this
business.
briefly, Phil, because whilst obviously this cause is very close and dear to the hearts of Sikhs, but the British government's approach has been very similar with other minority communities around the world as well, and you've been involved in those sort of incidents. And would you say this is becoming normal practice that is uncovering that the British government has been sacrificing lives of human beings and even British citizens in some cases for arms trade and ongoing military incentives?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just have to look at what's happening now in Yemen, right? The world's worst humanitarian crisis, which is largely being fueled by Saudi Arabia flying British-made planes, dropping British-made bombs. The planes are flown by British-trained pilots, and the catastrophe that's been going on there now for 5 years. I think there's so much money being made out of the total devastation of that country, one of the poorest countries in the Arab world. If you look at people in the House of Lords, like Lord Strathclyde, he's a Conservative peer. I think he used to be the Conservative leader of the House of the Lords. He is chairman of Raytheon UK. Raytheon is a missile company that makes guided missiles that are used by the Saudi military to drop on civilians in Yemen.
Exactly. And this raises a question. Yeah, and this raises a question because obviously we mentioned at the start that the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn at the time, put this issue, recognising that it was really important and significant to the Sikh community, put this as a manifesto commitment in 2017, and it remained a manifesto commitment in the 2019 December election. And having met with Keir Starmer, it's a commitment that's reiterated by the Labour leader today. So the political pressure is there, but again, I guess having seen the government's response in that they've not engaged with the community at all, they've dismissed calls, repeated calls by Sikh institutions, organisations for an independent judge-led public inquiry, that actually, even though initial legal proceedings had commenced, it's very clear that legally is the only route that looks like the government will be forced to share further information and further truths about this. And this is such a big issue for Sikhs that is one that we can never forget and will never forget. And it's disappointing that more conservative politicians and conservative supporters, especially those who are Sikh, haven't really pushed this more in the public domain, because if all the Sikhs came together, given that the Sri Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple as it's often referred to, is the most sacred shrine for all Sikhs, regardless of your political views, either here or in India, that the attack on such a sacred place, the killing of so many thousands of Sikhs, and there is direct evidence that the British government was involved, not only once, but multiple times, in various capacities, that the call and the demand for the truth and justice over that is not as loud as it should be. And this is something that we will continue to challenge and campaign for. And I know, Phil, from your work, it's something over the last 4 or 5 years you've also been very passionate about. And whenever the community has called upon your services, you've been very willing to support and share this. And I hope that we can continue this relationship. But ultimately, this is on the Sikh community to raise, especially those who have relationships with the Conservative government, but also all politicians, to really put the pressure on world, when politicians come to the Gurdwaras, that this should be a #1 priority. We are having to take the government to court today for our own identity of being Sikh and to be recognized in the census as Sikhs. And this is now unfortunate. The only way that Sikhs can get their recognition and truth is by taking them to the highest court of the land. And documents like this, cases like you've done in the Freedom of Information cases, now give us that extra ammunition that there was not only complicity, there was conflict of interest, and there is much more that is being hidden from the eyes of the public, that actually a judge-led public inquiry and a legal challenge is the only way the truth will come out. And I think in 2020 now, that this is something that the community must consider, think on, and really take their next steps forward. We're coming to the end of our show. I want to thank you again, Phil, for your support and your commitment. Is there anything that we haven't asked you, or anything you think that you'd like to share with the audience of KTV before we end?
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue, and like you say, once you understand how they've treated the Sikh community, you see it's not an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. If you look at what's happening to Yemen right now, and historically other communities as well. So this is a way of working for the British government, unless it's challenged by people and communities. It looks like it will continue.
And that's the duty of every Sikh, to pursue truth and justice. And I hope for 1984, this is a step that every Sikh will support. I know KTV has been championing this cause ever since the papers were released, but also the story of 1984 is covered on this channel, and it brings it to the homes of every Sikh. So I want to thank them again for this time. Thank you all to the KTV viewers. Please continue to support KTV, and we will keep you updated on this particular issue of the British government's involvement in 1984 and the declassified papers. Our show is ended here, so I want to thank you again. I thank you to my special guest, Phil Miller. You can follow him on the social medias. Thank you again. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.